The disaster off Cherbourg happened in my brand new Jaguar 25 sailing boat, which was the first and last new boat I've ever owned. It was Easter, and 3 months before I'd taken delivery of Gamine, which had been launched at Deacon's Yard near my top moorings on the River Hamble. 3 weeks later, I decided to sail to Cherbourg with my wife Monique to persuade her that this new boat was the answer to all her concerns about the discomforts of sailing. The day before, I'd successfully taken my VHF radio's operator's license exam. I was very proud of that achievement. It's the only exam I've ever passed in my life. So we left the top moorings on the River Hamble and gently sailed to Yarmouth, Isle of Wight. On the way, I installed the first VHF I'd ever owned, a brand new Sea-Line radio. Installed, well, I screwed the holder onto the bulkhead beside the chart table and ran a power line to a nearby power supply and plugged in the masthead antenna. That's about the top of my DIY skills. Having left the harbour of Yarmouth at dawn with a forecast of a northeasterly 4 to 5, Monique and I set off across the English Channel towards Cherbourg, which is some 60 miles from the Solent. 8 hours later, I was in a force 6 to 7 with a gale 8 warning from French Coast Guard and a broken rudder, and no way of steering my little 25-foot sailing boat away from Alderney tide race, which was sucking us away from Cherbourg. Gamine was my second boat, the first being a 22-foot galleon with a long keel and a bucket for a loo and no table to eat from. She was the best boat I could afford, and actually she was a very good sailing boat. Monique refused to sail with me unless there was going to be a proper loo and a table. I selected the cheapest boat I could find that had a proper loo and a table, a Jaguar 25, which in basic form was something I could get finance on from the bank, so I could pay off the loan, the mortgage on it, for over several years. The power unit was a Mercury 5 horsepower outboard on a sort of lifting bracket on the stern, and it also had a little sort of power unit, so it could charge a small battery and run the navigation lights and the autohelm autopilot. I mean, untold luxury. At the entrance to Yarmouth Harbour, the harbour master in a dinghy had led us to a berth, and I took Monique to a pub dinner in the Jolly Sailor, and we turned in for the night. At dawn, I listened to the shipping forecast, which gave northerly 3 to 4, locally 5, and although towards the limit for a little lightweight boat like Gamine, in those days I was pretty fearless. So without disturbing Monique, I headed out of the harbour and caught the early morning tide down past the Needles and into the English Channel. I engaged the autohelm, trimmed the sails, and made coffee for Monique. It was a little bouncy, but trailing my Walker log, it told me we were making 6 knots and Gamine seemed to be going well. A motor sailor, a fisher called Liberator, followed us, and I called them on VHF to see if they were heading for Cherbourg as well, which they were. Then I called Solent Coast Guard and gave them a TR, a traffic report, to tell them that we were on our way to Cherbourg and that I expected to be there by 7 o'clock in the evening. I felt very proud of my new VHF and very proud of my license to use it. A couple of bumpy hours later, Liberator called me and said it was too rough for them and they were going to go to Poole. Monique suggested we should do the same, but as I pointed out, the seafood restaurants were better in Cherbourg, and despite it being a bit bouncy, we were doing really well. At 2 in the afternoon, the weather forecast was now northeasterly 4 to 5, occasionally 6, but we were handling the wind well, and I felt there was nothing to worry about. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I read the Walker log, and I took some radio lighthouse fixings, and the cocked hat showed that we were about 18 miles north of Cherbourg and doing well for my ETA of 7 o'clock. I plotted the position on the chart. As I was writing down the time beside the position, there was an almighty bang out in the cockpit, and I climbed out to find the autopilot on the floor and the rudder helm sticking up in the air. I looked over the stern and I could see that the rudder blade had broken and the rest of it had jumped out of the pintle and socket, and was now only attached to the boat by a safety line. Gamine came up into the wind, which was now blowing a good force 5, and sails were flapping about everywhere. So I pulled the remains of the rudder into the cockpit, then climbed up on deck and took down both sails, and then went back to the broken rudder problem. The lower part was still slightly attached to the wider cheeks that held the pintle and gudgeon, and it looked to me as if I could support it with a wooden oar from a dinghy, tie it all together, brace it together. Now that's really the problem of reading books about intrepid sailors who break their rudders and then sail across the Pacific Ocean with a jury-rigged oar. I'm not that practical or indeed that physically strong. I got the wooden dinghy oar out of the locker and spent an hour struggling to tie it onto what was left of the rudder, sort of bracing it all together with rope. Then I had a major job getting it back over the stern. Then, try as I might, with the boat rolling really badly and the wooden oar and the rudder wanting to float upwards, I simply couldn't locate the pintles into the gudgeons, nor into the sockets. I was nearing exhaustion when, to my horror, the broken part of the rudder became completely detached from the rudder cheeks, and that was that. No rudder at all. I pulled the remains back into the cockpit and sat down, absolutely knackered. The radio, which was on channel 16, came to life, and a French accented voice started, "Sécurité, sécurité, sécurité. Northeasterly gale, 8, now imminent." Imminent meant within 6 hours. I mean, frankly, I was horrified. Not only was it a gale, but its direction was going to push me away from Cherbourg towards Alderney Race, which is absolutely not a place to be in a gale. Really big seas and rocks and serious problems. So I gave up self-help. I picked up the microphone of my brand new VHF, pressed the transmission key and went pan, 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 pan. Yacht Gamine, Gamine, Gamine. I have a broken rudder 18 miles north of Cherbourg. Frankly, the position was a bit of a guess, because after spending an hour or so messing around trying to fix the rudder, I was pretty uncertain how far the tide had carried me. You can get tidal currents of speeds of up to 9 knots in Alderney Race on spring tides, and we were on spring tides. Cherbourg radio came back and I explained my rudder problem, and they told me to wait. A British yacht came in and asked me for my position, and I gave it to him, and he went off to plot it on his chart, and then his radio signal became distorted and then finally faded. He must have been a long way off. I went back to the cockpit and I saw a big merchant ship, and I called the ship on channel 16. I called ship heading northeast with yacht on her port bow. This is that yacht Gamine. Nothing. Then I saw a sign on her side which said Freightliner, and on her stern the name Purbeck. So I called Purbeck, and she came back to me. I asked her to relay my exact position to Cherbourg radio, which she did. Cherbourg radio came in and said there was a French warship heading for me, and its name was Second Sous-Maître de le Bien. Oh, great, I thought. How on earth do I ever remember how to pronounce that? I then told Monique that everything was hunky-dory and that her French brethren were on their way. I went on deck and stowed the mainsail properly and tied the jib onto the guardrails. The wind was now blowing a good 30 knots with 4 or 5 metre waves. I mean, not brilliant, we just rocked and rolled. An hour or so later, towards, 6 or 7 in the evening, the VHF came alive again, and the Second Sous-Maître de le Bien, calling Gamine, on the VHF came up, and they asked if I could see them. I went to the cockpit and looked, I could only see distant merchant ships in the shipping lane. And then I looked over my shoulder, and there was the distant silhouette of a ship with a square stern. I gave them the bearing from me to them. A little while later, the unmistakable shape of a French warship came closer, and she stopped near to me. They started to lower a big inflatable with half a dozen men on board, and they had a hell of a time, because although the inflatable was to leeward of the ship, the waves kept swamping them. Getting their engine to start was clearly a problem, I guess because it was mainly underwater. In the wind shadow of the big warship, Gamine came up into the wind and started to head directly for the warship's stern. And there was no way for me to steer her, but I rushed to the bows and I tried to get ready to fend off. To my amazement, on a wave, I was raised up to the same helicopter deck level as a burly French seaman with a huge wicker fender was trying to drop it between Gamine and the warship's hull. He nodded to me. I nodded back. The captain of the warship then used his engines to screw his stern away from Gamine and put a safe distance between us. Finally, the crew of the big inflatable got the engine started and motored over. They were all in black wetsuits, and several of them clambered on board. The leading guy told me to come below with him, and he produced a paper out of a waterproof pouch and asked me to sign it. On the principle that you should never sign anything without reading it, I started to read the French document, and Monique lit a cigarette and said, "Just sign the bloody thing." So I did. So they did their thing. They built their harness and got themselves prepared, and the French warship came closer, and from its stern a guy with a rocket gun shot a line over the bows of Gamine across the forestay. The divers reached up, pulled the line in, and on the end of the line was a bigger, stronger rope, which they then attached to this sort of rope cradle they'd begun. They signalled on their handholds to the warship, and the tow began. The wind was now gusting around, 35 knots. It was very rock and rolly, and several of the divers who were still on board Gamine started to get seasick. After an hour or so, the warship ordered them to come back, and I asked them to take Monique with them, but they said that it was too dangerous. Well, great. So there we were, all alone again and in the dark. I decided to put on the navigation lights and make coffee. I felt really useless. I mean, every so often I would go out into the cockpit to look at the stern light of the warship up ahead. Down below, Monique curled up on a bunk and went to sleep, and in the end I just sat at the chart table trying to keep awake. I confess I dozed off. And then I came round and the movement changed. It became calmer. I went into the cockpit to see where the stern light of the warship was, and it was a very, very, very long way ahead in the darkness. Back to the VHF, I called them and I said that the tow line had broken. I heard what I think was a French expletive, and they said they would come back. Great, I thought. And I struggled into my life jacket and safety harness, as it was now very dark and very rough. The warship hove to close to us, and the captain said it was too rough to launch the rib again, but did I think I could take a line if they shot one to me and make it fast to Gamine? Sure, I said. And they told me to wait in the cockpit while they did this, as the bullet they fired over the bows was dangerous. Fine, I said. So I sat in the cockpit. The warship switched on a load of lights to illuminate the scene, and she came up close by, and she shot another line across the forestay, but quite high up. I struggled out of the cockpit, headed my way up to the bows, and I had a real battle to reach up for the line. Had to go back, get a boat hook, and use that to pull the nylon line down. I then stowed the stowed. I then pushed the boat hook into beside the mast and started to pull in the white line. It was quite thin nylon, and as I pulled it in to get the bigger rope, which is what I'd seen it happen with the drivers, I realised that I was pulling in the wrong direction. A big wooden bullet, came up out of the water. I dropped the thing on deck and started to pull the other end until I had a considerable heap, and then it became impossible to pull any more. The nylon line started cutting into my hands. So I took it back to the winch on the mast and tied it on the winch, got a winch handle and tried to winch in with that. It was impossible. And then the VHF went off again, and Monique shouted to me to come back and talk to the warship. The warship captain said they had wrapped the tow line round their prop and they couldn't move or assist me further. Then came a question: how much anchor chain did I have, as we were both drifting towards Alderney Race? I told him I had 20 metres of chain, 20 metres of rope, and there was not a hope in hell of anchoring in this depth or weather. I confess this was my oh knickers moment. Up to then there'd always been a solution apparent. Now it was blowing like stink, and there didn't seem to be an obvious thing to do. I went below again and sat at the chart table, feeling depressed. Then the VHF burst into life. "Gamine, le second soumet de le bien." "Go ahead, French warship," I said. "We have now cleared our propellers. There is an ocean-going tug coming to escort and assist if necessary." "Oh, great," I said. "That's marvellous. Can you come on deck to receive another tow line?" "Oh, yes, absolutely," I said, "on my way." Now, they really wanted me to stay clear of the bows when the bullet with the line came over, but I wanted to be able to see exactly what was happening, so I didn't want to pull the wrong end again. So I clung to the mast, watching. The warship brilliantly manoeuvred very close, and the rocket line guy fired his line across the forestay, but low down, so it was easy for me to reach. We were quite close, so the French sailors could watch me pulling in the leading line and very cautiously let out the tow line, so there was never much line in the sea at any one moment, and I could pull it in fairly easily. Once I had the proper tow line on board, I pulled in enough to tie it round the anchor winch, 2 or 3 turns, and lock it off, and then I took it back and took a couple of turns round the base of the mast and tied it off there. The warship then turned towards Cherbourg, brought the tow line up taut, and we set off at a sedate 5 knots as a big ocean-going tug came into view and motored parallel with the warship. I went below and assured Monique that was all was well, and we were now on our way to Cherbourg with 2 French ships looking after us. She was somewhat underwhelmed by this news and went back to bed. So I curled up in the cockpit behind the spray hood and dozed. Dawn saw us entering Cherbourg harbour, and a launch came out and undid the tow line and tied to a big ship buoy in the harbour area just outside the marina, and they took me on board the warship to meet the captain. His cabin was a disaster area, books and stuff all over the floor. I mean, clearly because of the problem they were having going slowly to tow Gamine, they'd been rolling like stink. The captain had another document which stated the time they'd arrived on the scene and the times Gamine had been secured to the buoy on Cherbourg harbour, a total of 13 hours. There was a lat long position on which I agreed to, as I actually had no idea of where exactly we had met up. And there was a charge of £13,000, £1,000 an hour for towing. He said the naval base would be in touch and the marina would have me towed in there. Apparently the French Coast Guard and the Navy had towed 3 other small boats, and on a 4th one the crew had been lifted off by helicopter, all of whom had been in trouble that night off Cherbourg and around Barfleur. I wonder if they've been charged as much as me, but there you go. Having been towed back to Cherbourg Marina, I now needed to get back to the UK and back to my BBC office on Tuesday morning to continue working on a drama production called Kessler, which was due to start filming in Brussels in about 4 or 5 weeks' time. The good news was there was a twice daily ferry service from Cherbourg to Portsmouth. Back in the UK, I informed the insurance company of the £13,000 rudder bill and got onto Jaguar yachts and expressed my displeasure at the broken rudder blade. Jaguar Yachts said they would send me another free of charge immediately, which they did, and it arrived 2 days later, except it wasn't complete. There was no new pintle and gudgeon fixed to it. Not time to wait for another one. I drove to Portsmouth on Friday after work and got on the ferry to Cherbourg with the new replacement rudder under my arm. I was not the only foot passenger who had a boat stuck in Cherbourg because of the Easter gales there. There were 6 or 7 other crews identifiable by their yachty wet weather gear and yellow wellies. Cherbourg Marina helped me find a French shipwright, and he came on board and agreed to remove the old pintle and gudgeon from the broken rudder and put them on the new rudder and install it all for me during that week. I got on the Portsmouth Sunday ferry back to Portsmouth and went back to the UK and work. The following Friday I drove down to Portsmouth again, got on the ferry to Cherbourg with some other yachty crews and also in their yellow wellies. The new rudder was there, sitting proudly on the stern of Gamine, beautifully fitted by the French shipwright. I looked at the weather forecast and it was northerly 5 to 6 right in the nose, so I got the next ferry back to Portsmouth. For the next 3 weekends I made the ferry pilgrimage from the UK to Cherbourg, now buying return tickets. Every Sunday I got back at midday because the weather was awful. Also, to be fair, my nerve had gone slightly. Single-handing back to the UK after that Easter night was something I wasn't looking forward to. Frankly, I was scared to go except in pretty settled weather. Went off filming in Brussels for Kessler, and when it was finished there was a 3-day break before the UK filming started, and I got permission to drive my filming hire car to Cherbourg and leave it there. The weather forecast was for light southwesterly winds. Perfect. I got into Cherbourg around 6 in the afternoon, paid my marina bill, had dinner at the yacht club, and then climbed into a bunk fully dressed and tried to sleep. Because I needed to get the tide going east up the Needles Channel, I needed to leave Cherbourg by 0500 in the morning. Actually, I didn't sleep for a moment. A mixture of fear and overtiredness and tossing and turning. At 3 o'clock I gave up, made some coffee, put on the navigation lights, let go my lines, and motored out of Cherbourg Harbour, heading into the dark night towards the Needles Channel. Then the navigation lights began to dim. I guess the little generator thing on the outboard motor was not charging. I had no nav lights, no radio, and the power for the autopilot with 11 or 12 hours of sailing ahead of me. The thought of turning back after so many attempts to get Gamine out of Cherbourg and back to the UK was pretty depressing, so I decided to carry on. I took the non-working autopilot off its bracket, took the tiller and started back to the UK with a torch shining on the compass, feeling frankly concerned. Dawn arrived, and there in the early morning sun was the electrical cable which ran from the outboard to the battery via a deck plug, hanging down, not plugged in. The shipwright had taken off the power line from the outboard motor to fit the new rudder, and I hadn't checked it. Entirely my fault. So I plugged it in, reconnected the autopilot, started the engine, and voila, it all worked. In almost no wind, I motor sailed back to the Solent under the autopilot, reading a paperback. I recovered my nerve, I got back on the horse, well, got back in the boat, and everything was fine. I wasn't scared anymore. So, that was my adventure, my near disaster off Cherbourg. Retelling this as not brought back exactly wonderful, good memories, but then, as my dear uncle, who was a professional skipper of luxury yachts, said, you should never trust the green blue stuff. Anyway, please press my subscribe button if you want to. It's really encouraging for me, but if you do, but if you don't, it doesn't matter, of course. Thank you for watching, if you have, up to now, and fair winds. Bye.